everybody. Welcome to the Anthony Hay Cabinet Shop here at Colonial Williamsburg. I'm the master cabinet maker, Bill Pavlak, and we wish you could be with us here today, but obviously for all of our safety, we're all apart, but still we're able to convene, so thanks for joining us. Please submit questions if there's anything you ever wanted to ask about cabinet making and related things. Send those our way. Before we really get started, just give you, in broad strokes, a little information about the shop in the 18th century and today. This was an active cabinet shop, one of several here in Williamsburg, where Anthony Hay opens the business sometime in the 1750s. The last master of the shop, a man named Edmund Dickinson, closed it in 1776, marched off to war, and unfortunately was killed in the Battle of Monmouth in 1778. In between those two different masters, there was another master named Benjamin Bucktrap. He was a London-trained cabinet maker, took out an ad in the paper when he took over the business in 1766-67 and advertised that he'd also make and repair harpsichords and spinets, so small, fashionable keyboard instruments in addition to the furniture work. That brings us forward to today. We actually have two trades in our shop. There are five of us. Myself and two apprentice cabinet makers, John Peeler, Jeremy Trichler, and then we've got two harpsichord makers, Edward Wright and Melanie Belanger. It's pretty unique for a cabinet shop in any time period to be doing both of those trades, although they certainly have a lot of similarities. Basically, a harpsichord is a piece of furniture, at least initially, and then it becomes this musical instrument. I thought we'd start today by talking about where we start, which is, generally speaking, with rough sawn lumber. We don't start with trees. Somebody else chops those down, thankfully. Somebody else churns logs into lumber, and then we get it. But when we get it, it looks like this. It's not flat, it's not smooth, it's not particularly pretty. It's a splinter party waiting to happen. We don't want that. So not only does every project start with this, sort of also where apprenticeships would begin, with converting this into usable material. And the chief tool in that, besides saws for breaking things down, would be a variety of hand planes. So this is a tool right here called a jack plane or a four plane, like four as in before, not the number. We use it first. It's got a blade down there that's got a little bit of a curve to it, so it can take a nice aggressive shaving. I don't need to worry about pretty and smooth yet with this board. I just need to get it close to flat and get some of this rougher stuff off there. This plane could be a little bit sharper. As I start working that down, getting a little bit closer, maybe notice that these bigger shavings coming up off this tool. When I feel like things are getting pretty good, then I'll switch over to a longer plane, straight blade, designed for making a board really perfectly flat and also smooth. And you notice at first, that's not doing much. It's just hitting the high spots. But now I'm taking bigger shavings. On we go, and normally I would check this with straight edges and other tools, squares, to make sure that we're actually making it flat and so forth. But just to do this edge is not a big deal. To do this on every single face of every single piece of wood in a massive project, that all starts to add up and take some time. If we look here, you can see, okay, rough sawn board, not the prettiest thing. There's some beautiful walnut underneath that. When I first started in here, I was sawing on this board. We call that resawing, where we're sawing parallel to the face of a board. We'll do this to thinner materials. So this, I just cut this off before we started. You notice how those two boards sort of match each other. That's the way it goes. You get that mirror symmetry. So we can start to play with our materials depending on how we saw them up. But again, if you can't do this, it's going to be hard to start any project. That's where we'll start training apprentices with that, in part because it's the best way to learn about wood as a material, and in part because that's that's the heaviest lifting, and we'd rather have them do that work than the rest of us. Any questions? No?
We do, and it's appropriate that you were talking about the wood because we have a couple of questions about the wood. Amanda would like to know, what is your favorite wood to work with and why?
Well, Amanda, thank you. I really like working with walnut. It's a hard wood, but it's a nice wood to work with. It's a beautiful wood. I also find it very appealing that it's a local wood. It grows right behind the shop. It grows very well here in Virginia. In the 18th century, they liked walnut. It was fashionable for all of these reasons, but because it was local, it was maybe a notch down from something like mahogany, which was coming up from the Caribbean. But walnut's probably my favorite of these things to work with.
And then Laura would like to know, what is the most common wood that you work with?
So I'll give you two answers. We think the original shop built more out of walnut than anything, because almost by definition as a cabinet maker, you're making fine, fashionable furniture, and walnut's going to be priced out of reach for most Virginians, but it's a little bit cheaper than the mahogany. But if we look at a massive, let's say a big desk, and it was made out of walnut, it's actually probably mostly made out of pine. So we usually will build things what we call primary and secondary woods. I'm going to show you a picture of a piece. Yeah, here it is. That reads on the camera. This is a high chest of drawers. It's made out of cherry, which we don't use quite as much as walnut or mahogany. Everything you see on this 8-foot tall piece of furniture is cherry, but everything that you don't see, all the drawer sides, backs, bottoms, the partitions between the drawers, everything but the first 3 inches, all of that is southern yellow pine. So in this piece, there's more pine than anything else, simply because it's cheaper, it works well, structurally it's beautiful, but to restate the first reason, it's cheaper. You can save a lot of money here without really killing the quality of the piece. Just sort of a nice thing to be able to do. Cut a corner like that without reducing the quality. This is a piece that's 230 years old, roughly. We're still looking at it, so the fact that they used some pine in it doesn't seem to have hurt. This drawer right here serves as a nice example of what I'm talking about. Two beautiful curly walnut for the drawer front. The drawer front is finished, it's planed, as smooth as you can get it. Turn it around and turn it over, you notice, okay, you've got pine on the sides, and this long leaf southern yellow pine is actually quite valuable today, but it's very stable dimensionally, doesn't move around as much with humidity changes as other woods do. You know, so everything's dovetailed together. Not only will we often use a cheaper wood for other parts, we'll also use a cheaper attitude. So if it takes a while to plane all these things, put your best effort here. The back face of the drawer will be hard to see, isn't finished. It's not quite as smooth. And the further you get into these pieces, the less finished and smooth things are. So when we look at the drawer bottom there, it's just all structure. This is quite rough. Still has marks from being resawn in it. Still has aggressive plane marks in it. Who stares at drawer bottoms? You know, so I do. And that's how I make my living, basically. Other cabinet makers and furniture historians do, but most folks don't. And I think people will be happy not to pay for all that extra work, so forth, on those hidden surfaces.
So Jeff would like to know, did you make your own planes?
That's a good question, Jeff. And once in a while, a cabinet maker will make his own or her own plane, but it's most common for cabinet makers in colonial America to buy their tools. Most of them would have been coming from England. The English have really begun to enter into the earliest phases of the Industrial Revolution, and manufacturing tools like that becomes part of that. It's a very specialized industry over there already. So there were plane makers, there were edge tool makers, saw makers, and so forth. Our merchants here know that a lot of us need tools like this. Today, this is, not a typical tool that you buy at the hardware store downtown. But in the 18th century, it was. So we could get these things generally for decent prices. It might take me a day or so, maybe a couple of days, to make a plane like this. And I'd still need to buy the blade, have somebody make the blade for me. or maybe I have the skills to do it myself. Whatever, it takes a while to make it. If I can buy this for about a day's wage and I have access to it, I'm coming out ahead that way. There were also some American plane makers as well.
Ethan would like to know what drove you to learn about 18th century cabinet making.
Thanks, Ethan. What made me become an 18th century cabinet maker? I certainly wasn't an 18th century cabinet maker before I started working here in 2005. But I was a hobbyist woodworker. I've always been interested in building stuff. Growing up, I did that quite a bit with my dad, but it was mostly knot and walnut. It was mostly pine, and it wasn't dovetailed together. It was screwed together and so forth. But at some point, about 20 years ago, I decided, let me try to make something a little harder. And then I thought, let me make something a little bit harder. And as I was doing that, I also became more and more interested in hand tools, because those were the tools I had access to at the time. Hard to have a table saw in an apartment. I just started to get more and more interested in the history. So my interest in the craft and the interest in the history sort of started together and developed together. And then thought, how can I make a living doing this instead of what I had been doing prior? And there was an opening here for an apprenticeship, so I jumped on that. And as I said, I've been here since, and now I'm the master of the shop.
Julia would like to know what piece of furniture, what type of furniture would you make the most of?
That's a great question. We don't have the account books from the original Hay shop, so I can't give you a definitive answer, but probably chairs. I know we're called cabinet makers, but again, that means mostly fine furniture, and often with things like side chairs. Here's one that former colleagues made years ago. A side chair like this would usually be purchased in a set of maybe a dozen. And so get a few of those sets in over the course of a year, and that's all going to start to add up. This one's in walnut. It's copied after a chair from the shop of Robert Walker, who was a Scottish immigrated cabinet maker working up along the Rappahannock River, not too far outside of Fredericksburg. There are also just so many different types of tables that I think, if I just said tables, there would be a lot of those over the course of the year. Big fancy things like the high chest I showed you a picture of before. This sort of thing, very few people can afford that, and once they have it, they only need one, where chairs, you can keep convincing yourselves maybe to get more chairs. And then tables, it seems like, for the fairly well-to-do in the 18th century, this is good for cabinet makers. If you were fairly well off, you convinced yourself that you needed a different table for everything you were going to do at a different time throughout the day. So you have a breakfast table, you have a dining table, you have a card table and a tea table and a writing table and a ladies' writing table, and on and on and on. So if you think you need a different table for every activity, that's good for me.
Keith would like to know if you could explain the process for producing a raised panel.
Okay, yeah, Keith, we will do that in a couple of different ways. Let me show you first what Keith means. You imagine a door. A lot of times there's a frame around the door, and then you have these raised panels in there. And the earliest examples, this beveled edge, isn't decorative. It's just to allow you to slide this panel into a groove within the frame, and this would go on the inside. And you would do it with a jack plane, just very quickly working that material off. Another tool that we like to use for this, though, when we get a little bit nicer, is, excuse me for 1 second. It's this tool right here. It's called a skew rabbet plane. So it's got this angled blade in there. By skewing or angling the blade like that, it cuts cleanly across the grain. If we think about a panel like this, you've got two cuts that are going with the grain, and then you have two that are going across it, and it's very easy for a normal plane to tear all that out. So a tool like this, which is really designed for other things, is nice for getting in there and creating that raised panel. But then there are also panel raising planes, and in fact, just about a year ago, plane maker. And today, many of our planes come from plane makers around the country. We got a dedicated panel raising plane, And so this one here, again, it has that skewed blade to it. It has a little fence right here that'll guide the edge of the plane along the edge of the board, register it perfectly from the first cut, and then it also has this depth stop built in right there. So once that surface makes contact with the top of the board, the plane will stop cutting. In fact, this plane was used to make that raised panel right there. I don't know if you can see that. This one, I'll tell you a little bit about this plane. It's got a nice story to it. This was made by a modern maker named Steve Voigt up in Pennsylvania, but it's copied after an original in our collection that was made by one of the earliest American plane makers, a man named Caesar Celler. Caesar Celler learned the trade of plane making from America's first documented plane maker, a guy named Francis Nicholson. Francis Nicholson actually owned Caesar Celler. Caesar Celler was an enslaved man. And when Nicholson died, he gave Celler his freedom, gave him a certain amount of property, some money, and some tools to set up and carry on his own plane making business. Just about 3 or 4 years ago, Colonial Williamsburg was able to acquire, through a gift from a man named David England, who passed away, and willed his collection of Caesar Celler and Francis Nicholson and John Nicholson planes to Colonial Williamsburg. So one of the great things for me working in a place like that is not only to have access to those old tools, I can't use them, but I can study them, but then I can also bring in makers from around the country to reproduce those for us, and this is a really nice example of that. So it's, you know, on one hand it's just a tool, but it's got this incredible story behind it.
Lindsay would like to know, which do you prefer, the 18th century tools or tools from today, and have they changed that much?
Yes, so when I'm here in the shop, I hope that the difference between our tools and their tools in the 18th century is as small as possible. If it's an actual 18th century tool, I'm more than happy to let that stay in the museum. And I don't know if I mentioned this, our expansion on the art museum will include some dedicated gallery space for some of the tools in our collection. So I really like using reproductions of 18th century tools, fairly traditional tools. There are also a lot of tool makers out there today that make more modern tools, and by modern they're based on late 19th century examples. Those are fantastic too. One thing I like about using new but old-fashioned tools is that I can know the makers, and that's always, to me, is very rewarding about using a tool that when you know the guy that made it or the girl that made it. It's it just adds a little more meaning to it for me.
Brittany would like to know if anyone has approached you with a special request of some kind, like a toy for a child, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a father, so I get requests all the time. Sometimes I make good on them. But I'm sure that would have happened in the 18th century as well. We get that question all the time. Kids often ask us, well, would you make a toy? So a wooden gun, you know, or a sword or something like that. And we might have, but the really nice, fancy toys would have been imported. And most kids would have, every kid can turn a stick into a toy. You know, I think they'd be doing a lot of that. But Anthony Hay, the first man who ran the shop again, had ultimately 9 children. I'm sure he made a toy every once in a while, or at least gave a kid some instructions on okay, you know, leave me alone, you can sit over there with this tool and maybe make something. You have to think some of that must have happened.
So both Madeline and Stacy would like to know, how long does it take to make a cabinet? And then John specifically was asking, how long would it take to complete a highboy?
Yeah, I wonder if that's John who's actually making the highboy with me. Probably not. It depends, obviously, but on this big high chest of drawers, we're estimating somewhere a little over 500 hours of work. There are 3 of us working on this, so we're sharing that labor time. Of course, today in this shop, we talk a lot, we research, and we do the work. So 500 hours could easily be 8 or 9 months. In the 18th century, you work, and you work, and you work. And it's a 6-hour work, a 6-day work week instead of a 5-day work week, and maybe you're working for 10 to 14 hours a day. So it still might take a little over 500 hours, but you'll be moving through that faster. If this was just a chest of drawers, maybe 4 drawers, you know, and it has some small feet on the bottom of it or something, I think the simplest ones of those probably 80 hours or something. But it always, of course, depends on the size and how much complexity is involved in it. I think there's the pieces we tend to make most often. Simpler tables that are still nice, chest of drawers and things like that will all take usually between 60 and 100 hours or so. The chair I held up before, and it's different than a cabinet, but this, because it's got quite a bit of carving and sculpture in the leg and some up in the slat on the press rail, this will take probably about 75 hours to build. If we just had straight legs on that and lost all that carved detail, we cut it down to half that time, 35 hours or so. But remember, we're going to now multiply that by 12. So, you know, you can go to the blacksmith shop and they can make a nail, you know, in a second. For us, you know, it always takes a while.
GB would like to know, how do you allow for wood movement in your projects?
It's a good question, GBB. There are a number of ways to do that. One of the classics is the raised panel I was talking about before. So imagine you had a door that had a frame. This would be actually a chair leg, but pretend that's part of a door. There's a groove in there, and the panel fits in that, right? Let me step back for a second. We know that wood moves in predictable ways. Wood is like a sponge. So when it's really humid in the air, there's a lot of moisture, wood will expand. And when there's not so much moisture, like in the winter months when we're heating and so forth, things tend to shrink. And they do that throughout the year. It gets wider and it gets narrower. Wood will never really get longer or shorter. It just gets, it moves across its grain. It becomes sort of dangerous then to join a piece in a cross-grain situation like this. Here the grain's running this way, here it's going this way. And as this piece wants to expand and contract, this won't allow it to happen, and maybe things will crack. Well, when the parts are this size, it's really not much of an issue. So you can make a mortise and tenon joint like this, put that whole door frame together, glue it up, and not have to worry about those. The movement is minimized. But this big panel that's in the middle of all that, that's going to move quite a bit seasonally. And if you have interior doors in your home that are frame and panel, or an exterior door that is, you'll notice that you know, this time of year these things are going to start swelling. So what you do is you cut a groove in all of this, you slide your panel in that groove, you then glue everything else together, and you just let this float in that groove, and it'll expand and contract within the groove. So you make this just a little undersized so that it has a little room to grow, but you don't glue that. I think a lot of, I used to have a front door that had been painted a billion times by the time I moved into the house, and the paint acted like glue, held the door in place. So in the winter, when things were dry, there was a big crack in the middle of the panel, and in the summer, that closed up. It happened every year that I lived in the house. So that's one classic situation. Another quick example would be the dovetail joint here. So if you look at how that is put together, like this, not only is it a mechanically very strong joint, but it's putting parts together in a way that's going to allow them to expand and contract. And as they expand and contract, a nail or a screw might eventually work loose, but this is all going to stay together. So a lot of other strategies. Sometimes it's a matter of attaching a tabletop. It would be screwed into the apron, but the holes for the screws are a little oversized. That allows the top to expand and contract. When we study pieces, we see what they did well and we see what they didn't do so well. If they didn't do it so well in terms of wood movement, we might choose a different 18th century way to do it. We try to learn as much as we can from these pieces that we study, the great collection that we have here. Sometimes what we learn is, of course, this is a great way to do it. Other times what we learn is, no, don't do it this way. You know, this didn't work. It's been fixed 100 times in the last 300 years. So, but wood movement is something that we're constantly thinking about. It makes almost everything that we do a lot more complicated than you'd think it would need to be.
Maggie would like to know, do you paint the cabinets?
That's a great question, Maggie. Sometimes we do, and it can be beautiful. It was pretty popular to do that. When we look at antiques from colonial America that were in more Germanic communities, you see a lot of very decorative paintwork. The English tended to not do quite as much of that, at least here in America. And in Williamsburg, we're pretty English in our tastes, but we'll see, a lot of painted furniture, solid colors, usually not the high-end stuff. So the high-end stuff will try to show off those pretty woods, but for more utilitarian things, a kitchen table or a cupboard or somebody like me is more of a working man, and might keep my clothes in a blanket chest, and that would be painted. So, we do a little bit of painting in the shop, but not as much as our joiners do, for example. They'll do a lot of the architectural woodwork. So in the really nicest rooms, you might have beautiful mahogany furniture, but behind it is painted woodwork to get a nice uniform color in there, brighten things up in a candlelit world. And if there are moldings worked into the room, those will read better when there's just a solid color on those.
So I think for what's probably our last question,
all right,
Keith would like to know, what is the greatest misconception we have today about woodworking and furniture making from the 18th century?
Gosh, that's a big question. I'll think of the best answer as soon as we're done. The biggest misconception, I think a lot of people think, sometimes because we see this stuff literally on pedestals in museums, people have paid hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars sometimes for it. They think that it's all amazing in every single way, and that nobody does it like that anymore. And the fact is that some of that stuff is great, some of it's okay, most of it's okay, some of it was bad, a lot of it was bad, we don't even see it. But it's not just all singularly amazing. Most pieces that are really good will have some things that are really good and other things that you think, well, yeah, maybe you could have done that better. That's how all my work is. But then, I think a lot of times people have this idea, some people do at least, that we'll hear this a lot in the shop. People come in and say, well, people don't make stuff like this anymore. And it's like, well, we try, and there are also a lot of people out there that are still doing it. So that's one misconception, is that they got a lot right back in the 18th century, did a lot of beautiful work that's still with us, but they don't have a monopoly on that good work. So thank you all for joining us. Stay safe and healthy, and go and make something really, really cool. And come and see us when we open back up. Thanks again.